Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Bible Hangout. I am Reverend Sherri James. I'm Senior Minister of Up Church, or our longer name is Understanding Principles for Better Living Church. We are the living legacy of the Reverend Dr. Della Reese-Lett, and I am the Senior Minister of this amazing spiritual community, and this is our Thursday night Bible study. I want to just share with you just a little bit about the Bible Hangout origins. The Bible Hangout actually started when Reverend Della was still alive and teaching, and was a senior minister, and I was teaching a Bible class, and we had so much information in that class that there was just no way for me to cover all of that information and inside of the time that we had allotted. And so I started this, I don't know, like kind of side class just to share the information, and then it has grown into this. So that was back in 2013, and so what I love about this, and what my mission is for this, is really that I work to change people's lives by exposing them to their divine nature, and so I want to invite you to be a part of that process. If you are new here, welcome. If you are local to Los Angeles, please come visit us on a Sunday. Our services are at 1 o'clock at 600 West Queen Street in Inglewood, California. And if you're new here and you're watching this on YouTube, please go ahead and subscribe. Using the Bible as my primary text, I really work to show people their divine nature. And I know that you're here because you know that there is more to you than what you see between the crown of your head and the soles of your feet. And so I'm here with you to be your partner in exposing you to your divine nature and finding your path. So I'm excited to do that. We are in the midst of a series based on one of my teachers, the Reverend Dr. Mary Ann Tumpkin. She wrote this book called A Student's Guide to the Hebrew Scriptures. And what we have been doing is looking at what is actually in the Hebrew Scriptures, because what we've been told is in the Bible really is someone's interpretation of what they have read. And so we are going to the Scriptures for ourselves to get the information for ourselves, and then you can decide what is it that you want to believe, because essentially someone has given you their belief about what's in the Scriptures, but not actually giving you the opportunity to say whether or not it actually works for you. And so we're going to take a step back. We're going to go get into some of the Hebrew. We're going to get into some of the history and some of the things that we know about our Bible, and hopefully that will help you make an informed decision about what is right for you. And that's what this series is about. So before I get into the outline tonight, we're talking about the primeval story. I want to do our opening prayer. And so if you would just become still and just recognize that there is only one power, there is only one presence. Now, we may have many names for that power and that presence, depending on where we grew up or what spiritual tradition we were brought up in, but all of it leads back to the same thing, which is that there is only one power and only one presence. And we know that this power and this presence breathes itself as us. And so we don't operate on our own accord, that we are the operating power of the one power. And so we thank you, God, for this unique relationship that we have with you. And we just ask that what's shared here in this class be for the highest good of all concerned, and that there is growth and expansion for everyone involved. In the name and nature of the one that we call the Christ, we affirm that it is so, and that's how we'll let it be, and amen, and ashe. All right, let's get to it. Hold on. So tonight's conversation is about the primeval story, or what we call the primeval story. Primeval would be like origin story. And that's a little bit, I should say this, that's a little bit of a misnomer, because one of the things, and we'll see this when we get into it, that's unique about the Hebrew religion is that there were no origin stories, meaning that God just is. And that was a definite break from the Mesopotamian religions that surrounded or that influenced what we know as this early Hebrew tradition. So primeval is a little bit of a misnomer, but we'll go with it because that's what scholars call it, and that's how it's acknowledged academically. All right, we'll go on for a second. Okay. All right, so I'm starting on page 22. I am on page 22. Page 22 is where I am. And so this statement says, so we're talking about the origin stories in Genesis chapter 1 through 11. This is what scholars or academics call the primeval story. And what it refers to are the earliest stages or the earliest ages of cultural development in the Hebrew world. Now, the first letter A, the primeval story, the primeval story is what goes in that blank, is a sweeping account of the earliest events from the creation of the world to the spread of humanity on earth. But the writer only mentions those seminal events that fit his purpose. When you dig into what we call the primeval story, or stories, right? Because it's where there are multiple traditions. There's a tradition of God creating the earth in 6 days. There's a tradition of God fashioning man out of the dust of the ground. There's a tradition of Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel. There are all those traditions, and I call them traditions because they started as oral stories that were passed down before they were, for centuries before they were actually put on paper. These stories, when we get into them and we start to study them, what we find is that they are not unique to our Bible, and that there are stories from the communities that were next to and interacting with this Hebrew community that influenced what the stories and what they became. They're not exact copies. There are actually some interesting distinctions that were made in the Hebrew stories that I think are pretty fascinating, and I'll get into some of them. But for example, more than 1,000 years before the Israelite legend of Noah and the ark, you have Mesopotamians telling the stories of Ziusudra, or in some versions, Utnapishtim, who also survived a great flood by building an ark on the instruction of a deity. And the flood destroys all life, and he sends out birds to scout out the dry land, and so on. So there are parallels like this that basically show that the religion of the Israelites was not so different from the religion of their neighbors, that they were very much influenced by them. These stories were borrowed from them, but then adapted to fit their point of view. What is also interesting is that there are elements of the story from the Mesopotamian neighbors that are left out of the Israelite traditions. So there were some key differences, and we'll talk about those tonight. There were some key differences that show up in the Hebrew story that don't find a parallel in, or should they don't find a parallel. You can see that they were taking these stories and they were adapting them to fit their version of their understanding of God. And so they were obviously sourced from these other communities, but then adapted when they moved into the Israelite community. I'm going to encourage you, because I'm using this microphone, so that it will disable your ability for me to hear you if you have a comment. So I want to encourage you to use the chat if you have any comments or have anything that you want to add to the conversation. please use the chat. And of course, if you're watching this on YouTube, if you put a comment down, I will absolutely respond to the comment. Unless you're trolling. I don't respond to trolls. So no trolling. Why is this giving me a hard time? Uh-oh, I may be freezing. Yep. And stop the share. I think I got a problem with my Wi-Fi. Just give me a second. I'm going to switch over to my iPad hotspot. Great. Okay. All right. So hopefully this should take care of the problem. It does not. Ah, there we go. Okay. All right. So the primeval story is not history. There should be a word not there. The primeval story is not history. History is what goes in that blank, as we ordinarily use the term. The earliest events of creation, for example, had no eyewitnesses. Now, this may be a big challenge for you if you have been taught that the Bible is the inerrant word of God, and if it appears on those pages and between those covers, then that's it and that settles it. And what I am telling you is that the story is not history in the way that we talk about history. When we say history, if I say, well, tell me the history of the early things that happened in this country, and you would begin to tell me about how the country was formed, how the governing documents were developed, what were some things that were actually happening in the country. Those would be historical facts. You would be able to go back and say, those things happened. There were people there who could tell you that, well, this is how we first got here. And these are the things that were going on. But there were people that were a part of the equation. The primeval story is not history in that sense, because as you can see in Genesis 1 and even the early part of Genesis 2, there are no humans. There are no human eyewitnesses. These are stories that were explaining how things came to be. So history is what goes in that blank. The primeval story is not history in the way that we think of history in our modern day. Stories such as we find in the early chapters of Genesis are mostly myths and sagas. They are mostly myths and sagas. So there is the myth of how the earth was created. There is the myth of how man was fashioned by God, or how man was created, or how man came to be. There was the myth of Cain and Abel, or the saga, if you will, of Cain and Abel. There was the saga of Adam and Eve, and how they, being born into a perfect environment, or created or planted in a perfect environment, somehow ended up out of that environment. So these are myths and sagas. Applying the term myth to Genesis in no way devalues or demeans the story. So sometimes what happens when we're looking at these stories, we have our modern definitions of the story, and that's not the case with this story. When we talk about myths in our time, at least I'll use my experience. So I learned about myths in grade school. And in grade school, myths were false. Meaning they were like these made up stories, and there was something that made them less than because they were these made up stories. That and they represented a primitive people who believed in multiple gods. And so even though we had, quote unquote, the separation of church and state, there was still the point of view, because I'm speaking about Greek mythology and Roman mythology, that learning about these people who had all these gods that they worshiped, that it was like a lower form of thinking, if you will, that they had these myths about their world. So you have to separate that, because that's not the way that I'm speaking about myth. And then when academics use the term myth to describe the stories in Genesis chapters 1 through 11, we don't mean it in a way that demeans or devalues the story. They may not provide the earliest history exactly as it happened, but they do communicate Israel's deepest truth about the world in its relationship to God. So this is really, okay, this is the part where I want to bring in some of, and I hope I do a good job of this, because I did a lot of research and I got notes everywhere, so y'all just bear with me. So one of the things that historians do is that they go back and they look at the history as like what was happening around that time. And what they know is that the stories that appear in Genesis 1 through 11 were written down somewhere during the Babylonian exile, during the time. So at this point, Israel is no longer an independent nation. They have been decimated by the Babylonian empire, and the people that the doers of the nation have basically been carted off and put into service to the Babylonian government, right? So this is what's happening. And the priests and the scribes get busy recording the history of the people, or recording the oral traditions of the people as a way to preserve them. Now, what that tells us is about the relationship that Israel had with God, or that Israel had with its God, I should say it that way, because it was Israel's understanding of God. And so the stories tell us more about the people living during the time of the Babylonian exile than they do about the people that they are writing about: Adam, Eve, Moses, Joseph, Isaac, Rebecca. It tells us more about the people that wrote the story than it does about the people that they were writing about. But it communicates this unique relationship. So one of the things that is interesting about what are termed, pagan religions, is that there was this idea that there exists a realm of being prior to the gods and above them, upon which they, the gods, depend, and who decrees even they must obey. And so it's this like meta divine realm. And it's the realm of supreme and ultimate power, and it actually transcends the deity. It actually created the deity. So in the pagan religions, you would find this creator God unknown, but then you'd have all these these other gods that handle like the natural forces. And so there was this deification of nature. So for example, you might have a god that was a god of the water, or you would have the god of darkness, or you have the god of fate, or something like that. But gods were associated with natural forces. And then the gods were not the source of all. They were bound to and subservient to the meta divine realm. And so there was no notion of a supreme divine will, or an absolute or a sovereign divine will. The will of any single god could ultimately be countered by the decrees of the primordial realm, and the will of all the gods could be thwarted by the decrees of the primordial realm. So you get these hierarchies that when you see the pagan religion. And so there is a story that we know that our creation story comes from, which is Enuma Elish. And the story starts, when on high. So it starts that way, talking about the gods and the primordial realm. The other thing you get when you are looking at um, uh, the pagan religions that influenced the Israelite tradition is that you get theogonies. And what that means is that there's the birth of a god. So, and if you know about the Hebrew religion, there was no such thing as the birth of a god. When we open at the beginning of Genesis, God just is. God isn't created by there's no God higher than God. The other thing is that when we meet the forces of nature, like the water, the darkness, the light, these things are created by God, and they are de-divinized, right? So all the divine nature that had been attributed to it in the pagan religions is just de-divinized. So the Israelites took a lot of the stories from like the Mesopotamians, but they de-divinized nature. They de-divinized, water and the trees and all of those things that in the uh, uh, religions next to them, they had ascribed a divine nature. The other thing that's interesting is that God is good, and if you go back and you look at the pagan religions, what you find is that the gods could be evil, and so they actually create this universe where God is all good, and evil is not the area of the God. So in the pagan religions, you could have someone that possesses someone, or evil as this independent entity. But in the Hebrew tradition, you don't have that at all. There is no evil in the creation of God. That God is good, and He names His creation good. And so there is this inherent understanding that all is good, and that is a marked departure from the pagan religions that they were influenced by. The other thing that you find in the pagan religions is that you find this ability, what is it called? It's called apotheosis. And what apotheosis is the movement of a God becoming human or a human becoming God. Now, Christianity aside, in the pagan traditions, you have this where you could have sometimes kings would become gods when they ascend to the throne, or someone would become a god after they die. And so you have this apotheosis, this movement between the meta-divine realm and the human realm. In the Hebrew tradition, you have no such realm. You have no such realm at all. But you have God creating humankind, and God is good and humankind is good, which is an interesting thing because they've got to deal with the problem of evil, but they never make evil a cosmic issue. That evil is a moral issue rather than a metaphysical issue. And so, and this again, New Thought pulling from that, because we see evil as something that happens in the three-dimensional realm, but not something that happens where evil is this entity moving around looking for a person to inhabit. That it is solely the purview of humanity. So in the pagan religion, there's no main God. Alita, she said de-divinized. Yes, it means to take the divine nature out of it. So there is no God of the water. There's no spirit controlling the water. There's no spirit controlling the trees or controlling the wind, or that when we see these same elements, right? Because the stories are not unique to our Bible, but when they show up in our Bible, they don't show up deified. They don't show up as independent actors. But when you see them in the pagan, but basically not Hebrew, in the non-Israelite traditions, they do have a divine nature. And so there is a God of the wind, there's a God of the sun, there's a God of the water, there's a God of all of the natural elements, the elements of nature. BJ says, so in the pagan religion, is there actually no main god? It depends on the pagan religion you're talking about, because there are many traditions. But these are like general characteristics where you have a primordial realm, the realm through which the gods were created, and then the gods operate, and then you have the human realm. So it's almost like 3 levels. And with the Hebrew or the Israelite tradition, it gets rid of the meta divine realm. There are no independent actors. You also in these non-Israelite traditions, you could have humans mating with God. You will find no such thing in the Hebrew tradition. You could have magic was a big thing, right? So people would practice magic for the purpose of getting the gods to do something on their behalf. And with Israel, there is no such thing. There's simply the agreement of the relationship that we have with God. We are God's people, and God acts on our behalf, period. Okay, why it's going so slow? So the deepest human questions give rise to creation myth. Who are we, right? This is, oh, excuse me, I need to sneeze. Excuse me. So these are questions that we all ask, and every generation asks them, which is, who are we? How did we get here? What is the purpose of life? And these 3 questions are central to almost every human experience. And there's something primal about these questions, meaning I see it even with Jordan at this age, that he may not be asking the questions that lead him to the cosmos, or may lead him to the cosmos, but he wants to know things like, who's my mom, who's my dad, and these are really important questions to him. And then his friends want to know, well, who's your mom, well, who's your dad? Like, these are really important questions that it's almost like they're on our heart for us to search who we are and to know who we are. And so it is these questions that have given rise to the creation myth. It is no surprise that virtually every people have given thought to ultimate origins, and every culture has shaped creation myth. So the bottom of 22, that's what goes in that blank, creation myth. Every culture has shaped creation myth. We have a new creation myth today. The creation myth today is the Big Bang Theory. There are no eyewitnesses on either of these. Both of these are based on our interaction with the universe. We have a different interaction with the universe than those early Israelites had. For that community of people, the earth was flat, there were 4 corners, the sky was held up by pillars, and you could walk to the edge and fall off. We have an entirely different relationship with our world today. Our world today, we have gravity. We understand that we are the 3rd rock from the sun. We understand that our galaxy is not the only galaxy, that there are many other galaxies. So these are all part of the things that have influenced our creation myth. And so if you could really grasp that the creation myth in Genesis is based on the interaction of the people with their world and how they understood things to be, or how things came to be. And they did their own investigations, their own questioning that led them to the conclusions that became the predominant story of how we came to be here. Just like we have done our investigations, we have formed space stations and rockets, and we've done travel around the earth, we've done travel to the moon, We have launched spacecraft to go out to the furthest reaches of our galaxy. We have discovered the presence of black holes. We have discovered the presence of atoms. We know that that nothing in the universe is standing still, that underneath a microscope, you could actually see the movement of the molecules, so that we know that even when something appears to be solid, it's not solid. And so all this stuff, we know about the presence of germs and how things can be passed down. We have an awareness of how the body works that's completely different from those Israelite communities and their understanding of how the body works. So all of those things go in to influence why our creation myth doesn't match the creation myth of what we see in our Bible. And it tells about who we are as a people, rather than our story is right and that story is wrong, or the reverse. Let me know if you have any questions about that. Feel free to post them. I would be happy to answer them. Oh, thank you, Constance. She said that was so beautifully explained. Thank you for that. My little thing is just moving so slow. Okay, something else. All right, so a myth. Modern authorities do not use the term myth to denote something that is false. Something that is false is what goes in that blank. Modern authorities do not use the term myth to denote something that is false. Rather, myth is a culture's way of coming to grips with fundamental reality. So we have a fundamental reality. We know that we are not the center, that the earth is not the center of the universe. You can look at the creation story or any of the stories in our Bible or any of the historical stories, and there's no conversation about other galaxies. There's no conversation about other worlds or aliens. It would be interesting to do an etymology of the word alien and to know when it came to mean a being from another planet versus a foreigner from another country. Our world has changed. I mean, our world view has changed. So when our creation myths fit the fundamental realities, for us, gravity is a fundamental reality. I would say the ancient Israelites knew that if you walked off of a building, you could fall, but they didn't necessarily use the term gravity to describe the force that pulls you down. They also, as far as we know from any writing, had no concept that there was actually a realm that we could access where gravity disappears, where you could go into outer space and you are no longer held or bound by the gravitational forces that govern our earth realm. So our creation myth, or all of our myths, all of our reasons for how things got to be, influence us coming to grips with our fundamental realities. So a culture's myth reflects its worldview. A myth is a traditional story of supposedly real events, right? There's nobody there when the so-called Big Bang happened. It is a traditional story of supposedly real events that is told in order to explain a culture's beliefs. It does not mean necessarily something that is false. It is based on the investigations that we have done with the best equipment that we have, with the best thinkers that we put on it. This is what we think happened. It is told in order to explain a culture's beliefs, practices, institutions, or something in nature. Myths are often associated with religious rituals and doctrines. Religious rituals and doctrines is what goes in that blank. Myths are often associated with religious rituals and doctrines. Both early cultures and modern ones have their particular myths. The cosmology of the Big Bang is a contemporary myth that strives to account for the universe. It remains a construct under frequent revision, even though it is backed by scientific evidence and reasoning. So as we expand our understanding of the universe, the Big Bang Theory gets revised. And there may come a day, based on our relationship with our universe, where the Big Bang Theory is as credible as the God created the earth in 6 days theory. There are at least 4 places in our Bible that contain reflections on creation. Psalm chapter 3, Proverbs 8, 22 to 31, Job chapters 38 to 41, and Isaiah chapter 40 verses 12 through 31. So this idea of who are we and where do we come from and how do we get here, these are, and why are we here? Like, what's the purpose of all this, right? Those questions are central to who we are as people. Now, I think that we need to all answer these questions for ourselves and not just take what our parents have given us or what the ministers have given us. I think that we have to answer these questions for ourselves. The challenge is that many times people have given you their perspective on how the world is set up, and then they've made it wrong for you to have a different idea about it. VJ asked the question, can you define the word universe? I'm trying to think about how I want to define it. Universe, it really depends on your worldview. So I would say universe for me includes this earth, includes outer space, includes the known galaxies as well as the unknown galaxies. It includes all the life on this earth, on the earth, under the earth, and in the seas. Birds that fly in the air, and it also includes my inner verse, right? The stuff that's going on inside of me and the stuff that's going on inside of you. So I consider that all of the universe. But you may have a different definition. You may when you speak about the universe, you may only be talking about this earth plane and everything contained inside of the gravitational pull on the things that are impacted by the gravitational pull of the earth. Someone else, or I would say the Israelite mind, the universe for them was it certainly didn't stretch to include what we think of as the earth, because the earth, the idea of the earth being a sphere is a later understanding. It's what we can tell from the writings of that time. People did not think of the earth as round or as spherical. They thought of the earth as flat, as having corners that you could go to the ends of the earth, that the earth had an end. There was, you see this in the creation story when they say you separate the waters from the waters, that essentially the firmament separates the waters from the water, that you had the waters that were above the firmament and the waters that were below. So they had to have a reason or an explanation for, well, how does water come out of the sky? Well, God separated the waters from the waters. And so there's the waters above the firmament, and the firmament is what kept the water from all just dumping down on the earth. And they talk about the windows of heaven. Well, it would fit that, like, you've got the water. Well, how does the water come out of the firmament? Well, God opened the window. Like, these are all like an explanation of the universe. So I would say, I don't know, I feel like I'm talking around what you're saying. I want to give a definition. So the God of the earth is the God of the universe. Well, I think you have to define that for yourself. For me, God is the impersonal, transcendent, loving, all good power that empowers everything that I can see, that I can perceive, and that I have an awareness of, and everything that I cannot see. And so for me, that includes other galaxies. I don't think of it as like God of the earth, and then there's a God of Saturn, or a God of the Milky Way, but there's a God of another galaxy. For me, the one power and the one presence is all there is. DJ says my answer is yes, yes. But I think these are reasonable questions to grapple with for yourself. I don't think that that anyone is wrong if they ask the question, because it's the question that gets you the answers. Reverend Mary used to say, she said, questions are like a grappling hook. And if you have ever done any kind of mountain climbing, and meaning where you need equipment to do a mountain climb, the grappling hook you throw up and it hooks in like the side of the mountain. And then it's the tension from the rope and the action of pulling yourself up the mountain, that it is the action of answering the question that actually takes you to a higher level of consciousness. And so you can never be afraid to ask questions. It's so important that you never kill the question on your heart or feel like, oh, I should know that, or I shouldn't ask that question. The questions are how you grow in consciousness. And so there should always be a question on your heart. And you may get to things where you have settled something for yourself. So for me, it's settled that God is all there is. I don't care how many worlds we discover, God is all there is. And I don't think of God as a man or a woman or having gender. I think of God as beyond gender. And that one power and that one presence that makes it all so, that makes the gravitational pull so, that makes the trees so, that makes space travel so. That same power is the power that then enabled the discovery of other galaxies, or enabled the discovery of travel even to other galaxies. Andrea says, yes, the formed and unformed worlds that move in, through, and around us. Yes, yes, yes. These are great questions. Great, great questions. Man, why is my thing acting up? Okay. Cool. There we go. Goodness gracious. I don't know what's making it drag. So, storyline. So I want to talk about the storyline. So God created the universe of stars, earth, and animal life in 6 days and rested on the seventh. So you know that this is the storyline of the primeval story. Okay, so there are, you can think of these as like the major events or the major epochs or the major points in the primeval story as far as the Hebrew mind is concerned. So the first thing is that God created a universe of stars, earth, and animal life in 6 days and rested on the seventh day. Each story is meant to explain a fundamental reality. So one of the things that this story is meant to explain is why the Sabbath must be kept holy. Each story is meant to explain, so it's meant to say why things are the way that they are. Why is it that we have to keep one day holy? Well, God created the earth in 6 days and he rested on the seventh day. These stories, if we could come out of the literal mindset of it happened exactly as it's recorded, and to recognize that myths arise to explain why things are the way that they are in our world. Letter B. The first humans were placed in the perfect environment. The first humans were placed in the perfect environment. So if God is all good and my life is not all good, what happened? Well, we started out in the perfect environment. But then what had happened was we did some stuff to get ourselves out of that perfect environment, right? Because I got to deal with the fact that my God has no evil in it. So it is not that what you find that's different between the God of the Israelites versus the other traditions that influenced it is that God is not capricious. That God is fair and God is just. And this is a departure from the traditions that influence the Israelites and the Israelite religion. That you don't have this God that just acts arbitrarily against his people. That God is always fair. I don't know what's going on, y'all. I never seen it just move so slow. Let me take a comment while I'm waiting. All right. There we go. Woo, goodness. They were expelled after they disobeyed a command. They were expelled after they disobeyed a command. Command is what goes in that blank. And this is found in Genesis chapter 2. Out of Eden, the first couple had offspring who typified the conflict between agriculturalists and herdsmen. So remember, stories deal with fundamental truths and are fundamental realities. Excuse me, not truth. The myths that arose as to how we got here deal with fundamental realities. And so the first couple had children, Cain and Abel, and they represented this battle. It's like, what's going on with the Hatfields and the McCoys? Well, what had happened was God needed a sacrifice. Cain brought one, Abel brought one, and that's why the agriculturalists live better than the herdsmen. These are stories about why things are the way that they are. You couldn't trace the long-standing thing back to a particular event, right? Meaning in your history. But there must be something cosmic about it, because in every generation there is this ongoing conflict between the people who are the growers and the people who are the herdsmen that attend to the animals. And so what the Israelites suggest is that this thing is as old as dirt. Like, they talk about the original sin. This is the original conflict, right? That it goes all the way back to God. And the children are the first two people on earth. It's that old. But sin ran rampant, prompting God to destroy everything with a flood. Oh, Deb said this discussion is so expansive and transcending my traditional thoughts. Thank you, Reverend Sherri. Thank you. But sin ran rampant, prompting God to destroy everything with a flood. Genesis chapter 6. Genesis chapter 6. So what's interesting, and a scholar said this, and I thought, oh, yeah, that's interesting, is that God is always having to course correct, right? The original plan was, let me put you in this perfect environment. But then humans do something that kind of mess it up. And so God is constantly having to course correct for these humans who make errors, but he never stops loving and caring about the humans that he created. And so he preserves Noah, right? That's our next one anyway. He preserves Noah. Oh, I'm sorry, this is the other part. Sin ran rampant. Sin, again, was in the Hebrew mind, was something that had happened in the realm of humanity, and that there was no divine element to sin. So there was that you'll never find in the Hebrew Bible the devil made me do, or even the concept of a devil. You just don't have that. It's not a. It wasn't a part of the Hebrew mind. Alita says, these were always my questions. Why was one sacrifice better? How could God kill all those people? Right. Yes, yes, yes. But sin ran rampant, prompting God to destroy everything with a flood. Oh. Come on. I'm trying to click to the next slide. I don't know why it does that, y'all. All right, I'm gonna do something. Hold on. Oh, weird. Okay. Who knows why that's doing that? All right. Whew. Only Noah, his immediate family, and a representative sample of animal life survived in a boat of design by God. Designed by God is what goes in that blank. Only Noah and his immediate family and a representative sample of animal life survived in a boat of designed by God. Now, when we're going through this, if you remember, a few weeks ago, we talked about the doublets, and we actually looked at the story of Noah and saw that it was interwoven. You had the priestly tradition and, excuse me, the Elohist tradition and the Yahwist tradition interwoven together in there. And so this is not what we're talking about right now. What we're just looking at is what is the outline of the primeval story. We're not considering the doublets. We're just looking at what did the redactor, the editor, if you will, of the different stories, what was considered important. And like I said, we know that that these stories are not unique to our Bible, that they were influenced by the Mesopotamian communities around them. Mesopotamia is in Africa, we say that. They were influenced by the Mesopotamian communities around them, and they took from those traditions, but they changed the stories in key ways. Namely, there is no birth of God the way that you have birth of the gods in those traditions. You also have God. There's no divine nature to the elements of the universe: the wind, the rain, the sun, the stars, all of that. You simply have God, and God controls all, and God creates. You have God creating humankind. What's interesting is that in some of those Mesopotamian traditions, humans were created to basically be the slaves of the god and to do the work that the gods, meaning that there was a higher, the primordial realm, and then there's that meta divine realm where the gods that were male and female, some good, some bad, where they lived, they got into fights and stuff like that. They were the ones that were responsible for the earth in those early pagan traditions, and they pleaded with the primordial gods, if you will, to relieve some of their stress. And so, as a token or throwing them a bone, the gods created humans whose responsibility was the earth. And they essentially allowed the gods to live a leisurely life because the humans were now going to tend to the earth. Again, this is in the Mesopotamian traditions that influenced the Israelites. And so what you see is you still have this idea of God creating humans, but it's no longer this idea of humans being slaves to the gods. So there were all these, it was like they took these stories and they made these changes, but they were key changes that created this universe that was a friendly universe. So I thought that was really powerful and interesting. After the waters subsided, God made a covenant. Covenant is what goes in that blank. He made a covenant. But Noah's episode of insobriety marked the return of wrongdoing. And this is Genesis chapter 8 through chapter 9. Still, humanity grew in number. Genesis chapter 10. They began building a massive tower to reach heaven. To reach heaven is what goes in that blank, in order to make a name for themselves. But God frustrated their plan and scattered them abroad. Genesis chapter 11. Finally, the primeval story ends with the genealogy of Shem, from whose lineage comes Israelites. Through him, God would reestablish fellowship with humanity. Israelites is what goes in that blank. I have a comment. Andrew says, so glad we can interpret metaphysically to make sense of it all. I agree, but one of the things that struck me, Andrea, was actually how, in some respects, the New Thought tradition of God closely mirrored the Hebrew monotheistic version of God, meaning that God is good, His creation is good, there is no evil that's created in God's creation, that any evil that happens is happening down on earth and has nothing to do with God. I thought those were really interesting things, interesting elements. Anything else? Anything else that came up? Alita, you said these were always my questions. Why was one sacrifice better than another? How could God kill all those people? Right. So again, they are coming up with stories about why things are the way that they are, and it's kind of like saying, like why does God let evil go on? Right? We ask this question. We ask this question a lot, especially after September 11th, 2001. Like, where is God? Right? Or I know people ask that when we have, one more killing by the police of an unarmed Black person. Like, where is God? Or you have, something, the bomber that killed those people in Christchurch in New Zealand. Where is God? These questions are questions that are on the hearts and minds of people even today, and they were certainly on the minds of the people then. And the question of, well, why won't God intervene? And it was, well, when God did intervene, He destroyed everything because He was so mad. And He preserved one family, but then that family, Noah, through his insobriety, brought back all that drama. So, it ain't God's fault. It's the fault of the people. Again, the myths always come up for the purpose of explaining why things are the way that they are. What I want to challenge you to do is to ask yourself that question, to come up with your own answers. We have been given a point of view of why things are that they are, and you have that it existed for a long time and still does in the minds of many people, the idea of the enemy or the adversary, and that the adversary is trying to do something to me. But I'll tell you what's happening. We're learning so much about what the mind can do and what the brain can do, and I mean, it's amazing the discoveries that are being had in quantum physics. And when you read some of the work of Dr. Joe Dispenza and Greg Braden and one of the first, Bruce Doyle, and some of these quantum physicists or these scientists, and you start to look at this brain research and to realize things like there's heart math, that there's a type of breathing that you can, your brain has a rhythm and your heart has a rhythm. And that there are activities that you can do that will get your heart and your brain in sync with one another. And that when you're under stress, they are out of sync with one another. And so they're erratic. But when you clear the stress, when you relax yourself, they get into a pattern together. And they can see this on a brain scan. I mean, they can see this. They hooked up is it EEG and an EKG, right? Electrocardiogram and electroencephalogram. If they hook those two up, they can see those things. I think it was Ray Kurzweil that says that we're about 10 years off from being able to like regrow limbs, like really regrow limbs. You know, no, that's not what he said. He said live forever, like you know, save for like getting hit by a bus. There will be no reason why you need to die. We're at that place as far as biomedical science is concerned. Finding cures for disease. That young lady in down at Morehouse, I'm about to say Hadia Nicole. I'm gonna mess up her name. Anyway, I think it's Dr. Green, Hadia Nicole Green, I think it's her name, but I may be mixing her up with the young lady that had AIDS. But the doctor, the young Black doctor down at Morehouse, and she is using nanotechnology to shrink cancerous tumor cells permanently. And she's done it. Like it's not theory, she's done it. We're at the precipice of a massive change in how we see our world and how we see ourselves. And so this idea of the enemy, I think this is why people are running out of churches, is that this idea of the enemy just don't make any sense anymore. When you know what you have the ability to do, and you know what you have the ability to how to control your physical being, this idea of the enemy gave me this, or try to get me, or try to get my children, and it's like, what are you talking about? Where are you coming from with this nonsense? Because our world is changing. And so new creation stories are going to come up. It doesn't do away with spirituality. We're spiritual beings. We're more than what you see between the crown of your head and the soles of your feet. But we're going to still grapple with those questions about why are we here? You know, and what is the purpose of our being, and where do we come from, and who are we? And so as we grapple with that, new creation stories are going to come up. Thank you, BJ. She says, Dr. Green, thank you. Ivana says, it is said that our heart is more connected to our intuition, more so than the brain, or something like that. I would bet money that that is true. I would bet money that that is true. I mean, there's some amazing technology that's out there, and I think that we in our community, in the New Thought Christian community, need to be in conversation with those academics, because none of it does away with the spiritual aspect of life. You will always have the spiritual aspect of life. It'll look different, but you will always have that there's this idea of the infinite, the idea of more, and you don't do away with God just because you learn that you are immortal. Any questions? So next week we're going to start on the ancestors. Oh, I do want to give you a homework assignment. Those of you that are doing this for credit, for continuing education credit, for Unity or for UFBL, on page 111 there is the Primeval Story. Page 111 is class activity 2. Class activity 2. So that if you would do that and turn that in, and then we're going to start on the ancestors, and we'll probably get through the Abraham cycle. So we'll do pages 25, 26, and top of 27. So we'll deal with the ancestral story of Abraham. Any questions? No? Well, hopefully sound was better tonight. I'm going to get a different input so that I'm able to hear you guys if there are things that you want to share. But thank you so much for being here tonight. And I hope that this has helped you in your spiritual walk and hopefully even given you some peace, right? And, you know, Dr. Coleman talked about just getting rid of that fear that we have around the Bible and the fear of questioning the Bible and the fear of questioning what we've been told about the Bible. And hopefully this has done some good to help you begin to let go of some of those old ways of thinking that no longer serve. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you. Have a beautiful night, and I will see you guys next week. God bless.